Welcome to the Modern Application Development Screencast. In this short screencast, we will learn how to build a simple RESTful API using SQLAlchemy and Flask. Before we start, open the following applications on your desktop so that you can work along with me. A browser, Chrome or Firefox, text editor or an IDE. In this case, I am using Sublime Text. Any IDE would be okay. I'm just using the IDE for syntax highlighting and some basic help, not really using in-depth one, especially because IDEs differ and I want to use the bare minimum functionality from an IDE, so that any IDE you would be using, you should be able to follow. Terminal, I'm just going to use the terminal that comes built into your Ubuntu desktop, and one of the API browsers. In this case, I'm going to use Insomnia that we have seen before. Now, before we start building an API, we need to know what API we are going to build. That starts with the documentation. Like last time, we saw how a documentation is built. Usually, when you are a developer and a designer wants you to implement an API, he gives you documentation. And one such format is OpenAPI, and you would have already gone through the details of it in our previous screencast. Now here is that same document that we built in the last screencast, which defines the API for user model or user entity. It has just 4 APIs, all CRUD related ones, or just read, update, put, and delete. And then some error codes, what should it throw when there is an error, and what should be the output formats, like in case of, for example, valid output, how it should look like, or if in case of invalid, or if there is an error, how the output should look like, examples like that. It's important for you to go through this in detail before you start actual coding. Otherwise, you would end up doing or implementing something that's completely different from what has been designed or documented. So start with always going through the documentation first and planning your implementation. Now we'll start with the same project that we built previously, which has a structure of standard your Flask application. But we are going to just add an API part to this. Now, before we start implementing the APIs, we don't want to really implement every part of it. We want to use some existing framework, so it helps us to build the API. There are quite a few, frameworks that are available in the Flask world to implement APIs. One of them is, REST Plus, which is popular. RESTful, which is another one which is popular, and also simple. In this case, we are going to use a RESTful. It shouldn't really matter which one you're going to use, because the input and output is going to be like standardized, and what APIs framework that you're going to use shouldn't really matter. But in this case, we'll go through one of the default ones or one of the standard ones, so it's easy for all of us to follow. Let's start with the Flask RESTful. It starts with installation. Let's install it. And since we already have environment set up, here I have not actually removed the environment, so I'm going to start up from the beginning. Before we do that, I'm just going to upgrade my requirements.txt with another package called Flask RESTful, right? So I'm just going to add here. Then I'm going to call my local setup. It's just going to create an environment, activate it, and install things in the requirements.txt. Since we have added Flask RESTful, it's going to install that also. Let's start with that. Yeah. So I'm going to do ls. I'm going to do sh local setup. So it's going to create a .env folder for virtual environment, and then going to install everything that is required. Done. Yeah, it's installed. So now if we start using local setup or local run rather, it will going to set up environment and as development and start the main.py, which is our main application, right? So let's start, and just to check whether everything is running, sh local run .sh, it's running on port 8080. Let's just try it. Cool, seems to be running, right? This is what we have done until now. So now we are going to add REST APIs to this. REST APIs is also a form of controllers. So we're just going to add another module here to do all our controlling of REST related controllers. But before we do that, we are going to initialize the Flask RESTful framework as part of the app, and then configure it, and then start with the rest of the things, right? So to configure it, let's import the Flask RESTful and then init the app. All right, okay, to import, I'm just going to copy paste. I'm just going to import resource and API actually from the Flask RESTful, and then I'm going to init the app with Flask RESTful, right? That's done by just doing this, API equal to API of app, right? And then I just want it to be accessible, so I'll just do initialize it to none and return both app and API. So here, okay, so now we've imported the framework RESTful API and then initialized it with our app, and then we just set the API object with that value, right? That's the minimum setup of the thing. We have done that. Now we are going to add a module to write our RESTful controllers. I'm just going to call it api.py, nothing complicated. We're just going to call it api.py. You could further divide into, if your models or business logic is huge, you can even create a folder called API. Within that you can call multiple, like for example user_API, etc, etc. Here I think it's simple enough, so we are going to call it api.py. In that we are going to write our API controllers. So since we are going to write it for user class, I'm just going to call that user API. All the API classes in RESTful are going to extend a resource class. So let's start with that. So this will be our class which will handle all the user related APIs, and it will extend resource class. Now this resource class is from RESTful, so I'm just going to extend that, import that rather here. So I'm just importing the resource and extending it. Now we need to write get. If you go back to here, we need to do get, put, delete and post, right? We need to write all four. So let's put the basic structure for it, right? So it's going to be a def function called get, which will handle all the get requests. I'm not going to implement anything. I'm just going to call pass. Similarly, put, delete, post, right? So all basic structure of all the request handlers, specific to each method, like when the method is get, when the method is put, when the method is delete, and when the method is post. Currently they are not doing anything, they're just passing, nothing specific. right? The next method, next thing is to map them to actually, to URL handler. Let's go to our main.py. Here actually we have defined the regular controllers where you have done the mapping directly. For example, here is the mapping done. So here, since we have class 1, we can just directly define them here. Let's just add it, right? By first we'll just import it. So we're going to import the user API from .api, user API, the class, and then just going to map that class to our URL path, right? I'm going to map it to a path called /API/user, and it takes string username as a thing. Now this is done because in our documentation you could see that the URL parameter is present for 3 of them at least: get, put, and delete. So that's why we've done the same thing, and it's of the type string, hence that type here as string. Now there's one more, which is post, which doesn't have a URL parameter called username as part of its URL. So we just need to map this as well directly, because this is not going to handle it, right? So that can be done by just adding extra parameter here to this function. So now this user API handles both these URL structures, this and this. Both the patterns are handled. So when the user access /API/user, it goes to user API /user/ username also goes to. If required, we can write a separate one, but we are writing, it's easier to handle with the same thing. Now when you actually do this, where does this how do you access this username in our functions? So it actually, when you pass it as part of URL, it comes as part of the function input parameter. So your get will get username, your put will get username, your delete will get username, but your post won't get username, and hence this will be mapped to the post, the rest of them will be mapped to this, right? So this is this structure, all of this is handled like this because we have the documentation which prescribes us to do it in that way, because in the get we have username, in the put we have username, in the delete we have username. In the post, we don't have username as part of the thing because we are going to create a new user as part of post, right? And we have done that. So now basic structure is done. Now the part is we can just start it and try to see whether we are getting actually values or not getting values, etc., etc. Let's just do at least get. Let's not do that. Let's just print username. And return the same thing as a JSON, right? Just for us to try. This is not the end result we want to see, but just to see whether everything is wired properly and all of them have been linked properly. After that, we can get into main application development. So now what we have done, we have initialized the app, we have created it, we have imported the user API, we have done the URL mapping, right? And the same thing here. So let's not just do for get, we'll also get for other, we'll also do for others, so that it's easy to check it out whether all of them are working. So let's make it get put delete. We're not doing anything, we're just printing, right? Post, just to try. So let's see whether our server has started. It's running. Just going to restart it just in case. Now let's go back to our documentation and go to delete and click on, just make sure first the URL is mapped well. It's 127.0.1.8080/API/user. Okay, it's running on 8080. Yeah, it's running on 8080. It's localhost and /API and /user. This maps to our mapping here, /API/user and username. Okay, so everything seems to be correct. So let's try delete. You can click on try it. You can enter the username as Raj, click on execute. It's run. You can see here it's run and it's returning username as Raj, right? Is that what we were trying to do? Yes, we were trying to return username as Raj. That's correct, as part of delete too. But here you can see in the print statement it's getting called delete /API/user, and we are returning here this username : username, and that's what we are getting as a response here. Now just to make it clear, we can also, this is for just our debugging purpose, action, I can call it delete, just to make sure that it's working. I'm just going to restart just to make sure. Most of the time it should restart automatically. If not, you can just restart just to make sure. It's running now. I'll try to execute it once more, right? Execute. Right here you can see username, action is equal to delete. So it's all been wired well. Let's check just to post and other things as well, just to make sure all of our functions are mapped. Try it out, execute. So this is throwing error because this doesn't have a username here, right? This is not, there's no username here, so it can't print a username. It is just post. Okay, let's save it. Let's restart it and try it again. Okay, seems to be wired. All post is wired, delete is wired. I'm just going to cancel this. Delete is wired. Let's try out get, execute. Get is wired, and then put. Let's just click, try it out and execute. Yeah, so you're getting the result here, whatever you're passing here. So they all seem to have been wired. Now we'll have to actually see the documentation and do the real business work. So what is get? Get is actually generally whatever is the username passed, get that user from the database and return the results. If everything works well, you have to get a user ID, username and email. If there is an error, we should send an error message, or if there is a resource not found, we have to return 404. If internal server error, we have to give 500. We have a standard way of doing errors, which is like error code and error message. I'm just going to use the same thing for get as well in case of any error. But in case of get, there's not much validation. It's just either it's not found or it's found. So we don't really need error message here. So let's try and implement get. So what we are getting here is username. Now, what are the steps involved? Get the username, okay, and get the user from database based on username, format the return JSON, return, right? Now format the return JSON also has to be based on user. If there is no user found, we have to send 404. Let's see that once we reach that point. First, get the username. We are already getting the username. We don't need to do much. I'm just going to print it, just to make sure that we are getting actually in user API get method and I'm just going to print username, right? So this is just for debugging, right? In case if you're trying to see why you're not getting something. Now the next is get username from database based on the username. We've done this before. We need to just import the DB and run db.session.filter. So let's do that using SQLAlchemy. From application dot database import db, right? So now we have application.database, we are importing this db. Now we can do user equal to db.session dot query the user model. So if you're querying the user model, we have to import it. So from application dot models import user. So I'm just going to make sure that model name is correct. Yes, it's user. Right. Now we are querying the user and we need to filter it. Let's do that filtering. It's just dot filter. We are going to filter it based on the user.username. That is user.username is equal to this username, right? Whatever we are passing, and then get the first one. Correct? Now if the username is actually sent correctly, it should return the correct username. If it's not sent properly, then it should result a wrong user. So we can just do if there is a wrong username or the username doesn't exist in the database, this user will be null. If it's null, we have to send 404 not found, because that user is not found. Error, right? So we can just check for that condition. If user return the, I'm just going to write the comment first, return a valid user JSON, else return 404 error. Correct? So that's what we are going to do now. So here or just going to return 404. We'll see how to do it better. So usually you can return the response and the response code as parameters for this function. So that's why this is written like that. Then let's see, while returning the valid JSON, the format should be as defined here, it is user ID, username, and email. We can pull it out from our user thing. So user object or user model. So we can call user.username. Just making sure the columns are correct. User ID, username, email. Okay, seems to be correct. Let's try it out. Okay, I'm going back here. I'm giving Thejesh as a thing. So this has to change. Execute. You can see user ID, username, and email has changed. Now, if I give some random thing, like let me open the database. We have only 2 users. Let's give Ali as a username and execute. You found that you are not getting any response, but you are getting not found as the thing. But here response is empty. I don't want to get empty JSON. I just want no body. So you can just return empty string, right? Let's end that, start again, and click on that, execute. So nothing is returned and not found. Can probably return none too. Let's see if it can return none. Not sure about this, but we can try. Yeah, I think you can return null, but empty string is a much better option if you're just doing bare bone like that. Okay, so this is how you do it, but this is not great because we are trying to create JSON on the fly and we really can't control formatting. What if there is a date and we wanted to format the date in certain way, or we didn't want to include certain columns in etc etc. So for that we use something called marshalling to marshal the output so that it's easier for us to format this written JSON in a very standardized way. So you can go to Flask RESTful and check for marshalling. Not here. Flask RESTful output field here. So you can send something called marshal with, or you can add a annotation marshal. So you actually define the fields which you wanted to be part of the output and then use that. Let's define our output fields first. Let's call our output fields, right? I want it to have user underscore ID of type string, but to do that we need to import fields from Flask RESTful. I'm just going to do that. Sorry, I'm going to import that. Flask RESTful, import fields and marshal with. So this fields dot, we want the user ID to be integer, so we're going to call it fields dot integer is the type, right? And then similarly I want the username, I want that to be string. Similarly I want email email also to be string. Now you can just tag or annotate this function with marshal with and pass on the name of the fields that we created, output fields, so that the response will be marshaled with this format, like this format. So instead of returning actually whole JSON, you can just return user, and that should actually return you this formatted output. Let's see that whether that's working. Okay, let's go here and Thejesh, click on execute. You can see that it's working. Now why this is useful is, for example, if you don't want this to be there in your output, you can just delete it here and you don't have to do anything anywhere, right? You can just keep this like and as it is, and then you can let me just restart the server, and then if you call execute, you can see that that has vanished. You didn't have to do much. You can add many other things here. You can do formatting in certain ways, like for example, if you're doing price or cost, you can add rs or like commas for your bigger numbers and stuff like that. That it makes it very useful to format your output, and easy also. Now this is okay, but how will it react to this, right? So let's see. Now that we have done it, we have to modify it, but I just wanted to show you how it throws the error. I'm just going to do TT or Tom. So it's obviously not found, it's still doing not found, but it's still trying to format the body or whatever in this form way, and that's why it's throwing this error. Anyway, I think we also have to handle the error in a better way. We have to throw an exception to make it easy on uniform way of handling errors, because in future we will handle errors as an error message in the rest of the APIs. Hence, I think it's better to set up that error validation class and exception class so we can handle it well. The way we handle it is if the user is none, then I want to be able to throw an exception and just be handled by the framework. For example, I want to be able to do raise not found error, and I just want to say status code is equal to 404, and I think it should be able to handle the rest of the things. Now we can write our own way of there are built-in ways to handle this, but I'm going to write a custom way of handling this so that in future, if you want to build your own custom way, you can do it very easily. So let's create a class called validation, or a file called validation module .py. I just want to throw HTTP exception as a class, so that all our exceptions are extended of that and handled in a proper way. So I'm just going to import that here. That's the class that we are going to extend, and I'm just going to define a new class called not found error, and which extends HTTP exception, right? And then I'm going to define the constructor for it, which takes HTTPS code and makes a response with empty message and just a status code. This make response is a built-in function in Flask, so I'm just going to use that. Okay, so here is a built-in class, built-in function, and we are going to use that built-in function to run the code, create the response and return it. So now I'm just going to throw this error in our API. Right, it's the same error. I just need to import from application dot validation import not found error. Right. Okay, let's see if it works. Let's just restart just to make sure. Okay, it's the same thing. I think we shouldn't get this. We should get an empty body. Execute it. Yes, it's just not found. It's empty body. This content length you can see is 0. It's not returning anything. It's just returning the error code. But if I send Thejesh GN and click on execute, spelling mistake, hence not found. THEJSGN. Okay, now you can see that it returns the valid JSON, and like you can see the content type is valid JSON, and this is the format which was defined, and it matches the format. You can see that this is what we are getting, and this is what the example response was, and as defined. And when there is error, we are going to do error. Actually, there's no specific 400 because we're not sending any inputs other than Thejesh GN, which is parameter. So we don't need to do much of this validation. Same with 500. I think by default it will throw an error if there's an internal error. Or you can do a try catch here in case something happens while doing this. You can do a try catch and throw a 500 error as a measure, as a good way to throw a handling the exception. For example, if you're using a database on a different server, and if that server goes down, or if there's a connection error, instead of showing some random message, you can do a try catch and throw a really 500 error with a good message, so that downstream developer will know what is error. Now we've done a decent job with our get. Let's do another one called probably useful one for us to learn, post. Right, post is where you're going to insert a row into the database, or you can create an user. Let's look at the documentation as usual. So here is the post. I'm just going to cancel this. Here is the input schema. It takes username Ali and email. So it takes the URL of this format, /API/user, and it needs to be posted at that. On error on 200 you will get the whole body. On 201, this is showing the previous one actually. Let me just refresh it. In a valid insert, it just returns 201 and successfully created. If there is an error, it will return error. Sometimes it could also be that it will return 200. People would return 201 and actually return the actual object. So we can look at both, how we can do both of them, just for our information. But here, we should have to do according to the documentation. Hence, according to the documentation, on creation, we are not going to return any response body. We're just going to return 201. On error, we are going to respond with error code and error message. And there are a couple of errors defined here, that username is required, email is required, invalid email, duplicate user, and etc. We'll try and implement all of these errors because it's important, and that's what has been defined in the documentation. Let's see how the input format is this. Now in Flask, you can get the JSON directly from request. If you want, you can do that. You can just get the request directly. But Flask RESTful gives you an option to parse the request using something called request parser. We are going to use that in a limited form because we are going to write our own custom exceptions to throw an error. We are not going to use the inbuilt error because inbuilt error won't match the format of this. It has a different format of throwing error. Since we're going to use our own exception class to throw an error. Let's see. So I'm just going to write the details for a parser. So I'm going to create user parser, which is a request parser. I'm just going to add the argument username and email. This will be part of our request. So if you're going to use the inbuilt one, you can define type is equal to string, and whether it's required, not required, all of that. We are not going to do that because I don't want to use the inbuilt validator. I'm just going to use this just to pass simple ones. We can even go ahead and pass using JSON, request.getJSON and do the thing, but it's okay. Let's do using this. Once you do that, I'm just going to do get the args from the pass. So when you do this pass args, it's going to pass the request and then return the args. Args will have username and email. So let's get those values. So I'm going to get username. If there's no username, it will return none. If I'm trying to get email, if there's no email, it will return none. Right? It's straightforward. So now, in our case, username is a valid required field, and even email is a required field. So if there is no username found, I want to throw an error. Similarly, if the email is none, I want to throw an error. So let's just check. I mean, you can add more validation. I'm just going to show some simple validation. If username is none, I want to throw business error validation, business validation error with status code 400 error code B1001 and my error message is username is required, which is the same format that we have defined here, like with the error code B1001 and username is required as a message. Now, we have defined it, we have used it, but we are not implemented it. So I'm going to just implement it in the same validation class. I'm going to define a class which extends the same HTTP exception. And format also will look similar, just that our input will take more attributes. So it will take HTTPS to this code, error code, error message. So error code and error message has to be sent as part of the body. You can see that here, if there's an error, if this is the body and error code is 400, and we need to set up this as the response. So I'm going to make a response with these two, right? So message is equal to error code and error message. Okay, and then just going to return this. Now you can't return the object, you have to return the string. So we have to do JSON.dumps, which converts an object into JSON string. So you can just import JSON and do JSON.dumps. Now we have to, this is ready to be thrown or to be used. So let's go to business validation error and use this business validation error here. So we already used it, but we need to import it. Okay, so now we have it here. Let's try just see if it works. We'll just put a pass if to end it, if nothing happens. Just run it. Rec pass is not defined, so you have to define rec pass. Let's define it. Define it as in import it here. Okay, I'm going to import that also, so we don't get that error. Okay, running. Let's go here. Just going to extend this part to make it clearer. We are here. We are going to click on try it. I'm not going to give anything. Right? Click on execute. It ran. It threw an error. Bad request. BE1001. Username is required. You can see it's returning 400. Now let's just put some username. All right, execute. It's not doing anything, right? Because if this is valid, we are not doing the rest. So this statement and this business validation is working. Now let's continue with the same flow. And right, if email is none, we'll do the same. And what is the error code if for valid email? B1002, and B here means just business error. Could be any error code as per the designer, whatever they give. B1002 email is required. I'm just going to use email is required. We're going to use the same message and same error code that's provided by the design documentation, right? I think that's the idea of the design documentation, that we need to stick to it. Now, given the username, we'll try to execute it, throw an error with email is required. You can see that error code B1002 email is required. Okay. Let's see if email is valid. I mean, you could validate the email in many ways. I'm going to simply check whether the email has @ symbol. It's very complex to validate an email. There are many ways you can do that. You need to have a dot, you need to have a valid domain name, etc., etc. But I'm just going to go with the simplest validation here, right? I'm just going to check if email has @ symbol, and if it has @ symbol, I'm just going to consider it as valid. Okay, if in email, this just checks that email string has @ symbol, then I'm not going to do anything. Continue with my function. Else, I'm going to throw an error. All right, the error would be 1003 invalid email. Okay, let's see if our server is running. Yes. Let's go here. Let's add an email. Okay, except example.com, execute. Seems to be valid, but email is required is showing. Spelling mistake here, email. Okay, execute. So like everything worked, right? Because we have done, after that we are not returning anything, we are returning null or empty, hence the thing null here. But if I give a wrong email, according to us, if it doesn't have an @ symbol, it's a wrong email. So let's execute. Then it shows invalid email, right? Next, you want to check whether this username or email already exists in the database. If it exists in the database, then we don't want to insert, else we'll insert. Now you can check one by one, or you can check with an OR class, right? We will go with an OR class, a simple check, because I think here the error is actually duplicate user. It can be a duplicate user if its email has email is duplicated, or even if the username is duplicated. So we'll just check with the OR class, much easier. I'm just going to paste the query here, so you can check that it's a similar query as in get db.session.query user.filter user equal to username or email equal to email, user.email equal to email, then get the first one. If this returns a value, then we have to throw an error, right? Again, we'll throw a business error saying duplicate user. So we'll do 1004. I'll say duplicate user. Okay. Right. So now what we have to do is to check it. I'm just going to return else. Else I'm not going to do currently anything. I'm just going to do pass. We'll implement inserting in the next step. I'm just going to just check this step, whether this step is working. I'm going to restart the server. So we are given Ali and example. Let's return existing user or existing email and see whether it throws an error. Ali is a non-existing. Let's use this raj@example.com as an email and execute. It should throw an error, duplicate user. Now if I make it raj2, it doesn't throw any error. But if I make the user as Raj, then it throws an error, duplicate user. If both are also duplicate, then it should throw an error, right? Throws an error. Depends on what error message. If you want to give specific error message that duplicate email ID, please don't use. Then you have to check specifically and then throw an error. Then we'll have to probably write two queries and check it and then throw an error. Then if everything goes well, now we want to insert. To insert, we're going to create a new user. That's by using the user model, and it just needs two inputs. One is username is equal to username, what we got, and email is equal to email, what we got. We have created a new user, then we're going to add it to session and then commit, right? Then commit, right? And then either we can return a new user or return nothing. Just return 201, right? Return 201. Now let's see if everything goes well, it will return 201. Okay, let's see. Let's create another user called Raj2 example.com. Click on execute. 201, it returned 201, so 201 is created, and then you can see that it has returned empty body. We could make it completely empty. I'm just returning empty string here, and then let's go to the database and check. You can see Raj2 has been inserted. Now let's say our documentation was different, and along with 201, instead of just returning empty body, we wanted to return the whole object. It's much easier. We could just use the same Marshall fields here, right? We can just add here, and then return, instead of this, you can just return new user, right? And then let's try it with inserting another user. Go up, Raj3, and execute. You can see that it's returning actual object. Along with 201, it's also returning object. But you should stand to the documentation that was provided to you, which is in 201. There is nothing, no body to be returned. So you can always do that. Okay. So we just made it back to like what I had before, just to follow the documentation. So I just made it as before, just to follow the documentation. Nothing will be returned. 201 status code will be returned, and hence no marshalling as well. So that actually completes our post request. It's quite straightforward and simple. I've actually simplified a lot of stuff here. You could make it much more elaborate in terms of validation, checking, etc., etc.